Critiques of capitalism are a hot commodity. Within the realm of contemporary science fiction alone, labor rights surface in android films such as Ex Machina and Westworld. Environmental issues arise in dystopian novels such as Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. Class and wealth disparity appears throughout the Hunger Games franchise. Gender violence is visible in the TV series Dollhouse, and corporate power is questioned in the video game Horizon Zero Dawn. The irony, of course, is that the success of these cultural productions depends on their marketplace viability. This catch-22 puts popular artists in an economic bind where they must produce a social critique within the strictures of the market. Building on Frederick Jameson's work investigating the relationship between art and late capitalism, this paper considers the absent presence of the utopian possibility in one contemporary science fiction text, Dave Eggers' The Circle. In this novel, Eggers models how the seemingly innocuous actions of ordinary people often reify the political economy, even when it's against their best interests. This is a troubling prospect. After all, if, as David Graeber suggests, imagination is a constituent element in the process of how we produce our social and material realities, then the failure to imagine new political economies holds serious real-world implications. Today, I'm going to discuss Eggers' popular corporate dystopia in relation to the common notion that there is no alternative to capitalism, also known as TINA. Giving voice to activist concerns, such as the one quoted by Graeber above, I argue that part of the violence inflicted by the culture of late capitalism is how it directs our imagination away from radical action in favor of market-friendly reform. This redirection limits the horizon of possibility and forecloses revolutionary solutions to economic injustice. The Circle helps readers recognize this violence by amplifying corporate structures of power and then revealing how those structures affect the protagonist, May Holland, as she journeys through the late capitalist landscape. Through May, Eggers imagines the process through which individuals become compliant economic subjects and then shares that experience of subjection with the reader by offering no meaningful alternative. In the novel, The Circle is a corporate behemoth that changes the shape of the internet forever. The corporation is credited with popularizing the culture of radical openness that celebrates perpetual surveillance as a move toward communion and unity. By invoking a rhetoric of responsibility and social justice, The Circle manufactures a brave new world where secrets are lies, sharing is caring, and privacy is theft. Under these emergent cultural conditions, May's role shifts over the course of the novel from sympathetic daughter and compassionate friend to a loyal supporter of corporate power. What makes this transformation especially terrifying is how it occurs without May recognizing that it's happening. Even as May rises in rank and power at The Circle, she never realizes that the culture of late capitalism is manufacturing in her a new form of subjection. A closer look at May will reveal the complex processes through which this transformation occurs. In a 2015 interview, Eggers describes May at length. The author explains, quote, how he, quote, thought it was really important that May come from a point of relative disadvantage, end quote, so that she would feel, quote, like she had been given an incredible gift to work at The Circle, end quote. This statement draws a direct connection between May's socioeconomic status and her perception of corporate America. In other words, because May is lower middle class, she perceives The Circle as a modern path to the American dream. As a result, Eggers continues, she is inclined to discount any hints that something is awry. Given May's gratefulness for this opportunity, Eggers adds, and I quote at length, she has to be naive, willfully naive, because even when there are little signs of trouble, she doesn't feel like she has the right to blow the whistle. She feels that no matter how bad it gets, it's never worse than where she came from, which makes it something of a perfect storm for turning or radicalizing someone, end quote. This passage is emblematic of the heavy-handed determinism that led Margaret Atwood to describe The Circle as lacking, quote, thoroughly rounded characters with many layered inwardness. Harsh criticism. However, I want to suggest a more generous reading where I take Eggers at his word that May is quote, something of an everyman figure that does not view things with too much baggage or skepticism, end quote. Read in this light, even as Eggers invokes the regrettably sexist tradition of the flat female heroine, elsewhere described as the book's bone-deep misogyny, Eggers successfully sketches out a late capitalist structure of feeling. Modeling Raymond Williams' theory, the description of May above is less about denying her agency because of her status as a lower middle-class woman, and more about examining meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt. Eggers imagines the affective elements of May's consciousness within a social experience which is still in process. While this does not excuse May's weak characterization, it does offer readers a more generative approach to this narrative and a way to interpret her lack of agency. In the passage quoted above, it is clear that Eggers is concerned not with May's objective reality, but rather the affective perception of the world as she experiences it. She feels like she cannot be a whistleblower, and feels that no matter how bad it gets, it can never get worse than where she came from. These two sentences offer the reader no real indication whether or not these feelings are an accurate representation of the world or her agency within that world. Instead, Eggers presents May as always already defeated by living in a world that feels beyond her control. She enters the corporate world already, quote, inclined to discount any hints of that something is awry, and remains, as Eggers says, willfully naive to secure her fragile position within that company. May's willingness to conform to the culture of late capitalism echoes Eggers' own pessimistic declaration that, quote, all the people who work in these companies, tech companies, sometimes do stuff that goes beyond what they would approve of, end quote. Thus, in both his descriptions of May and his own account of Silicon Valley ethics, Eggers suggests that the workplace culture produces a corporate subject who is willing to suspend moral judgment in exchange for profit or comfort. What is most striking about May is the active and voluntary role she plays in her own subjection. The book opens with May's initial reaction to the Circle's corporate campus. My God, May thought, it's heaven. Sick of her meaningless desk job, buried in student debt and concerned about her father's failing health, May dreams of an opportunity to change her circumstance. The Circle becomes that dream. As an everyman figure, Eggers suggests that many of May's lower middle class peers share this perception of corporate America. Eggers describes May's excitement using language that inscribes a casual acceptance of late capitalist subjection even before she is hired by the Circle. For instance, when May values her time in capitalistic terms, calling it human potential and fearing that it would be wasted if not integrated into a more efficient system of the Circle. Moreover, May is troubled by the idea that the utility company that she used to work for might be, quote, holding back the turning of the globe, a hyperbolic phrase that suggests a desire for, or at least a latent acceptance of, a progressive growth ideology. In describing May's first trip to the Circle's campus, the Circle's corporate campus, Eggers writes, quote, May knew that she never wanted to work, never wanted to be anywhere else, end quote. Both the form and content of the sentence show how May conflates her work and non-work identities, suggesting a postmodern work ethic where there is no clear distinction between work and non-work responsibilities. May's transformation into the ideal corporate subject is further illustrated in her gradual acceptance of the party rank social system, where she voluntarily competes with other circlers to be the most active participant in unpaid corporate labor. In these opening scenes, Eggers foreshadows May's transformation by revealing how much she has already been subjected to the culture of capitalism. As a lower middle class subject, Eggers suggests that May's desires are limited to acceptable capitalist aspirations, financial security, meaningful employment, and a sense of workplace community. This limited horizon of possibility drives May deeper into the corporate world without considering that something might be awry. In addition to her economic circumstances, May is motivated by a desire for what Eggers calls the ideological purity of the Circle, which is described as simple, honest, and elegant. May experiences this ideological purity toward the end of the novel, where it's described as, quote, giving her peace, a warming feeling of logic and order, end quote. I find May's quest for ideological purity concerning for two reasons. First, the Circle's ideology is certainly not simple, logical, or orderly. Briefly defined, the Circle supports a global neoliberal agenda that challenges the sovereignty of nation states by aggressively advocating for privatization, deregulation, and free trade. Thus, May's desire for simplicity is doomed from the beginning. The second problem arises from this perceived notion of purity. Instead of confronting the numerous variations, inconsistencies, and complexities involved in neoliberal policy, May acquires her sense of purity by refusing to notice these contradictions. She looks away. Ironically, it is May's simple, honest, and elevated description of the Circle's ideology that makes it feel false and deceptive to the reader. For example, when May proposes that perfect democracy could be achieved through mandatory voting, she doesn't recognize the fascist impulse underlying the demand for compulsory behavior, but the reader almost certainly does. By the end of the novel, May ascribes the dominant ideology as absolutely as Winston does in 1984. Yet I find the Circle particularly apt at describing the capitalist subjection because it never appears as overt violence. While Orwell renders the violence of Winston's subjection visible through a series of explicit torture scenes at the end of the novel, Eggers does no such thing. May's re-education, call it that, unlike Winston's, is a slow process involving a web of formal and informal instruments of control, including sea change, party rank, and the Circle culture, among others. Eggers' model of subjection is decentralized, replacing the mid-20th century fear of the centralized state with the 21st century fear of unchecked corporate power. Insisting on plurality of power and influence, Eggers does not point to one discernible source of May's subjection. Instead, policed in a variety of voluntary, menial, and seemingly nonviolent ways, May simply appears to absorb the culture of late capitalism without a clearly discernible threat of violence, but also without her consent. No discussion of May's subjection would be complete without a discussion of her relationship with the two characters who challenged the ideological purity of the Circle, Mercer and Tighe. While originally sympathetic to the concerns expressed by Mercer and Tighe, May grows increasingly distant from the pair of critics and increasingly uncomfortable with their ideas as she begins to identify more fully with the Circle ideology. Mercer serves as a tireless advocate for privacy rights and refuses to participate in the culture of radical openness propagated by the Circle. At one point, after Mercer receives death threats from online strangers whom May shared a photo of his antler artwork with, he condemns May for her complacency in the New World Order. At this moment, what bothers Mercer the most is that May seemingly acts of her own volition. As Mercer explains, quote, "There are no oppressors. No one's forcing you to do this. You willingly tie yourself to these leashes," end quote. In this critique, Mercer, like Eggers himself, traces May's subjections back to her willful naivete. Mercer's criticism of May in the scene reveals how easily late capitalist subjection reads as a deliberate choice. By suggesting that there are no oppressors and no one forcing May to behave as she does, Mercer fails to notice the structural violence shaping May's actions and desires. As a result, Mercer inadvertently blames the victim, which leads to the eventual estrangement of these two longtime friends. Tighe's critique of the Circle is even more radical. As the original developer of the TrueU technology that has since become a totalitarian nightmare, Tighe tries to convince May to use her access and influence to disseminate a manifesto entitled "The Rights of Humans in the Digital Age" to her network and bring the corporation, quote, "back into some kind of balance," end quote. Tighe cites the Circle's growing market share of internet searches, noting that soon it'll be 100%. Then he then explains his concern with that level of monopolistic corporate penetration, arguing, and I quote at length, "Now, you and I both know that if you can control the flow of information, you can control everything. You can control most of what everyone sees and knows. If you want to bury some piece of information permanently, that's 2 seconds work. If you want to ruin someone, that's 5 minutes work. How can you rise up against the Circle if they control all the information and access to it?" End quote. Tighe describes the threat of absolute information control, recognizing that the power to control the flow of information grants that institution the power to control everything. After all, if the public can only see what the circle wants them to see, it's easy to manipulate and direct public sentiment. Resistance becomes inconceivable as the means to disseminate subversive information is all but eradicated. Anyone who poses a threat can be quickly discredited, or if that fails, quietly discarded. Despite Tighe's best efforts, however, May doesn't agree. While May also recognizes that the circle's completion is imminent, she perceives it as a promise, arguing that if everything is known, then, quote, there's no crime, no murder, no kidnapping and rape, no kids ever victimized again, and no more missing persons, end quote. Of course, May fails to mention the cost of this utopian vision. Perpetual human trafficking also means no more privacy and no more freedom. In the end, Tighe is unable to convince May that the circle needs to be dismantled. Instead, May tells the world about Tighe's bizarre claims and misguided efforts to derail the completion of the circle. May's declaration brings Tighe's resistance efforts to an abrupt end. After this betrayal, May never saw Tighe again, and by her own admission, quote, did not care to. These two relationships show, May's gradual transformation into a compliant corporate subject distances her from the radical critiques of the political economy that could help her question her newly acquired subject position. She also grows estranged from the people and communities that would serve to foster that critical perspective necessary to make those observations herself. This dual distancing effect is one of the most inhibiting and coercive elements of late capitalist culture. As May becomes increasingly dissociated with Mercer and Tighe, she can no longer understand their perspectives, refuses to accept their concerns as legitimate, and fails to imagine alternatives. By describing these relationships withering, Eggers models how the culture of late capitalism mobilizes a dual logic of community and estrangement that simultaneously promotes desirable subject positions, like May's, while discouraging and delegitimizing radical or subversive subject positions, like Mercer's and Tighe's. The widespread acceptance of the new world order in the circle drives Tighe literally and figuratively underground, conspiring against corporate agents alone and in the dark. Similarly, widespread acceptance of the New World Order drives Mercer first into the woods, and then also literally and figuratively off a cliff. In both cases, Eggers suggests that to not belong to the dominant culture is to risk losing your community or your life. As I have argued, Dave Eggers' The Circle describes a lower middle class structure of feeling that many living under the conditions of late capitalism may be familiar with. Using what one critic has called a strikingly sparse style, Eggers models the seemingly voluntary re-education contemporary subjects experience while trying to succeed in corporate America. The narrative describes how the contemporary U.S. political economy generates new modes of subjection that are actively and willfully performed and yet rarely recognized as oppressive. Moreover, in Eggers' corporate dystopia, as in our own world, resistance is marginalized and described by the dominant culture as misguided and ultimately futile. In the end, The Circle recalls the airlessness of 1984 and offers no hope of a better future, replacing mid-20th century anxieties with anxieties more appropriate for the 21st century. Eggers' closed ending formally recalls Tighe's conspiratorial claim that, quote, the figures who control the flow of information or make alternatives visible always shape the outcome. While this claim undoubtedly limits the possibility of meaningful resistance and strips subjugated groups of their agency, it nevertheless serves as an insightful description of the affective experience of late capitalist subjection. By not making any alternatives visible, the form of the novel reproduces the feeling of subjection that May experiences in the novel, and then shares that uncomfortable awareness with the reader. If we read May not as the flat feminine heroine that critics have described, but rather as a desirable corporate subject, The Circle acts as a parable, illustrating the slow and subtle processes through which the culture of late capitalism transforms economic and political subjects. I believe Eggers when he says that May is a sort of everyman figure, and suspect that the frustration readers feel at the end of the novel is at least in part a recognition that there is a little bit of May inside us all, a voice that is constantly advising us to distance ourselves from the radical critiques that threaten the comforts we've come to expect from living in an affluent capitalist country. Thank you.